Leo Phocas the Elder, Domesticus of the East, 917 to 919 CE. Leo Phocas was the son and successor to Nicephorus Phocas, the famous general from about 20 years earlier. Leo is most famous as being the uncle of the future emperor Nicephorus Phocas. However, Leo was an important figure in his own time. And in fact, if we look at the later years of the Regency of Zoe Carbonopsina on behalf of her son Constantine VII, we see that Leo Phocas the Elder was one of the most important figures of that era, and indeed was one of the competitors to become the power behind the throne. As we all know, however, he ended up losing out to Romanus Lecapenus. In this video, I'd like to explore Leo's career and look at why he was unable to protect Constantine VII from the usurpation of Romanus Lecapenus. Leo was the oldest son of Nicephorus Phocas the Elder, a prominent general during the late 9th century who primarily earned his fame fighting in Italy and Sicily. Leo had a younger brother named Bardas, who was born around 878, and this means that Leo must have been born before that date, but most likely not too far before that date. They were most likely relatively close in age. The combination of his family's wealth, his father's military fame, the death of Leo VI in 912, the death of Alexander in 913, and then the downfall of Constantine Ducas, who tried to launch a coup that same year, meant that Leo emerged as an important figure in the empire. He had the right last name, and he was the scion of the most powerful family in the military aristocracy. So people turned to him for leadership, and at least in the early years, he seems to have provided what was needed. We know very little about Leo's career prior to 917. We do know that by that date he was Domesticus of the East. It's possible, however, that he held the office of Domesticus as early as 913 when Ducas was defeated. At any rate, by the time that he enters the pages of history in 917, Leo was well established as Domesticus of the East. During this period, the Domesticus of the East was effectively the commander-in-chief of all of Byzantium's eastern armies, meaning that he was primarily responsible for expanding into Muslim-held lands and reconquering those lands in the name of Byzantium. This also means that Leo Phocas was without a doubt the most important military official in the entire empire at this time. The only way that someone could become more important than Domesticus of the East would be to become emperor and then be an emperor who takes the field. Otherwise, the Domesticus of the East is pretty much always going to be the most important military figure in the Byzantine world. Outside of being a Phocas and the son of the famous general Nicephorus the Elder, it's unclear if Leo had any real qualification for the post or if he had any military talent. We don't really have any way to know. We don't know of any of his activities in the East. We hear of no great victories during the period of the Regency, so most likely he never really had to prove himself prior to 917. To fully understand Leo Phocas's role in the politics of this period, we first need to understand the broader context. As I mentioned earlier, Leo VI had died in 912, and that left the throne to his brother, who was a childless middle-aged man named Alexander, and then Leo's son, Constantine VII. Alexander only lasted about a year, and when he died, Zoe Carbonopsina, the mother of young Constantine, was able to return from the convent and take over as regent of the government. However, as a woman who was not of imperial birth herself, her hold on the government was already and always shaky. This is also in the context of the wars that Byzantium had been fighting against Symeon I of Bulgaria, one of the greatest foes that Byzantium would ever face, and someone who routinely humiliated the empire. The problem was that Constantine VII would not come of age at 15 until the year 920. Until that date, Zoe needed to hold down the fort and make sure that Constantine would be able to take control of the empire in his own right without someone usurping the throne. With disasters occurring in the West, that made this prospect more and more unlikely. She needed to bring Symeon to heel somehow in order to shore up her strength and authority, and keep the throne warm for her son when he came of age in just 3 short years. This means that she was looking to win a great victory in the west, and of course one of the people she would turn to would be her Domesticus of the east, Leo Phocas. Zoe's government came up with a plan that was simultaneously simple in its conception, but would have some difficulties in its actual execution. She effectively wanted to make a large pincer movement on the Bulgarian realm. She sent envoys to the Pechenegs in the north, who agreed to attack Bulgaria from north of the Danube. Romanus Lecapenus, the new Drungarius, the commander-in-chief of the navy at Constantinople, would sail up north of the Danube and then ferry the Pechenegs across. Meanwhile, Leo Phocas had moved into the Balkans with a large army, and his job would be to lead that army north along the Black Sea coastline. Presumably the idea is that the Pechenegs would strike first and distract the Bulgarian army, while Leo made a leisurely stroll up the Black Sea coast, capturing territory and then forcing a battle against a weakened Symeon. Now, while this plan is solid in its conception, it was doomed to fall apart early because the Byzantines were relying very heavily on a lot of unproven quantities, including the Pechenegs, Romanus Lecapenus, who at this point had not really commanded any battles, and also Leo Phocas, who so far as we know had also never proven himself as a field commander. Like any plan with a number of moving parts and some unknown quantities, this was one which was bound to hit some logistical snags, but the plan itself could have a positive impact if executed, simply because of putting pressure on Bulgaria from 2 directions. Unfortunately for Byzantine war planners, the plan fell apart immediately and dramatically. In the north, Romanus landed his ships and met with the Pecheneg king, but the two of them quickly came to hate each other, and they nearly came to blows. What it amounted to effectively was a dick-measuring contest over protocol and titles, i.e. who would be in charge and how Romanus needed to address the king and vice versa. Both of them were extraordinarily concerned with being treated with the proper respect. The Pecheneg king because he was a king, and Romanus because he was a member of the superior Byzantine civilization. Neither of them were able to find a happy medium and do their job, so Romanus simply took his ships and went back to Constantinople. Without the Byzantine fleet, there was no way for the Pechenegs to cross the Danube, and after such a negative experience with a representative of the Byzantine government, one can imagine that the leader of the Pechenegs was not terribly inspired to find a way to fulfill his obligations. So the Pechenegs dispersed to the north. With this northern attack failing to materialize at all, Leo Phocas in the south would now be forced to bear the brunt of the Bulgarian military assault. It also appears that because Romanus made directly for Constantinople, that news did not reach Leo of the failure of the northern half of the pincer, so he most likely had no idea that he would have to face the full might of Symeon's army, and that Symeon himself would definitely be in command. The result was the Battle of Anchialus. On screen I've written out one description of the battle based on George Kedrinis's description, but there is an alternative version. And the alternative version of the Battle of Anchialus, what happened is that Leo and Symeon had been filling each other out, and then Leo decided to concentrate his forces on the right, and he managed to make progress there. The Bulgarians deliberately made their center weak so it would break, and the Byzantines made progress there. The left, however, held firm. Leo had basically achieved a breakthrough, but he seems to have fallen from his horse or something of that nature. The Byzantine army then thought that he had died, so they began to lose some of their cohesion. And at that moment, Symeon struck on the left unexpectedly with his heavy cavalry, and this brought the battle to a decision. It became a rout. The Byzantine survivors fled north to Mesembria, and Leo was able to escape from there. There's an alternative version, however, as I mentioned, from George Kedrinis, so let's go through that one. In this version of the battle, it occurs on the same day, August 20th, 917, and in this one, Leo and his army are camped near the port city of Anchialus. So far, pretty similar. Symeon had been stalking the Byzantines from the hills to the west, and waited for an opportune moment and then struck. So presumably he caught them while they were in camp and not ready to fight. During this attack, Leo happened to be taking a bath, and somehow his horse, I guess, may have been being walked by a groom or something, and happened to panic at the sight of the oncoming enemy attack, and then went stampeding through the camp. Leo's horse was very recognizable, and since the horse was riderless, his men naturally assumed that something had happened to their commander, which spread panic, and then the army effectively dissolved. Leo had to flee, perhaps half-dressed, from the battle and get north to Mesembria. So those are the two versions of Anchialus. Either way, however, it was a devastating defeat and a massive setback for the Byzantine cause in the west. Leo Phocas was able to escape by one means or another, but the bulk of his army was lost. These men were most probably veterans of both the Balkan and or Eastern armies. Usually when a major attack would be launched, field units would be taken from multiple armies and put together to form as elite and effective an army as possible. What this means is that to replace these men with men of equal quality, you would need to recruit, train, and blood a number of men to get them to that level. So this is something that will be a setback for years and will take a long time to make good. Almost a century later, perhaps 75 years later, Leo the Deacon wrote his account, which included the Battle of Anchialus, and he claims that he visited the site and that there are still sun-bleached bones lying on the ground where the battle was fought. So this gives you a hint of just how brutal this battle was and how it effectively broke out into a slaughter once the Bulgarians really got the Byzantines in a tight spot. Leo was able to escape north to the port of Mesembria, and from there he was able to find a boat and get back to Constantinople. Back at Constantinople, the disaster at Anchialus had caused a bit of a stir in the court. People were quite worried as the Bulgarians were now on the march with an unimpeded path to the capital of the Byzantine world. Zoe, for her part, was looking for someone to blame, and rather than holding Leo accountable for his defeat at Anchialus, she decided instead, perfectly reasonably, to blame Romanus Lecapenus for failing to do his duty and get the northern wing of the pincer in motion to prevent Leo from having to face the full might of Symeon by himself. Zoe was angry enough with Romanus that she actually ordered him to be blinded, but he ended up escaping that fate because his friends at court were able to convince her that this was an unwise course of action, so she not only relented from having him blind, but actually retained him in his post as Drungarius. This meant, of course, that she had now cultivated an enemy in Romanus, and he knew that she was no ally of his, so he began to work to undermine her interest. Zoe seems to have kept her faith in Leo, however. So, as Symeon approaches the capital of Constantinople through Thrace laying waste, Zoe decides to form a second army to oppose Symeon and defend the capital, and she entrusts Leo Phocas with the command of this army. Most likely this army was of much lower quality than the previous force that Leo had led at Anchialus. After all, many first-line field troops had been killed in the battle, and a lot of the men sent out for the second battle were most likely second-rate garrison troops or men conscripted on the spot. There aren't very many details of the battle that Leo then fought against Symeon, but suffice it to say that he left the gates of Constantinople, marched out to one of the western suburbs, and he was completely defeated. It seems that he lost another army in its entirety, more or less, although to be fair, this army was less talented, so it's not as embarrassing, and also this army was frankly less valuable since it contained fewer veterans, so it is not on the same scale as Anchialus, and as we'll see, this did not allow Symeon to follow up with an assault on the city since the walls were still formidable and there was no chance of him actually storming Constantinople itself. The twin defeats of late 917, both of which were in part due to bad generalship on the part of Leo Phocas the Elder, seriously undermined Zoe's standing as regent. The Empress knew that she would need a protector in order to shore up her prestige and stave off the challenge of Patriarch Nicholas Mysticus, who had initially held the regency shortly after the death of Alexander. And he was still in office as patriarch and still dreamt of reclaiming the regency. He was gathering allies to himself and trying to make a case that Zoe should be removed and sent back to her convent. Zoe therefore was looking for a strong political ally. Some people have assumed this meant that she was looking for a new husband in order to find someone who could take the crown and then pass it on to Constantine and rule in the meantime as his protector. It's possible at one point, according to John Julius Norwick at least, in his supposition, that Romanus Lecapenus may have been someone Zoe seriously considered because he was unthreatening due to his relatively low birth, but the problem is that she had literally just tried to have him blinded, and I'm sure that this would make that relationship rather awkward. Also, Romanus was still married at the time, and it just would not have been a very smooth fit by any stretch of the imagination. As for the other option, Leo Phocas the Elder was supposed to be rather handsome, and he also had a certain amount of charm. At least that's the portrait we get of him. He happened to be a widower at exactly the right time. He is the head of the most powerful member of the military aristocracy, and he is Domesticus of the East. Now that would seem to line up, but I will argue that rather than looking for a husband, Zoe was merely looking for someone who would be a strong political ally. She did not want to delay Constantine's rise to the throne by marrying someone who would want to rule for more than a couple years. And I think the evidence bears this out, as we'll see. For 2 or 3 weeks, Leo and Zoe met multiple times at the palace, and they came to some kind of an understanding. We don't really know the details of it, but it has led to widespread speculation that Zoe was contemplating marriage with Leo. However, this seems quite unlikely, as I mentioned above, because I think it's very clear that Zoe's goal was to prevent anyone from gaining control of the empire before her son came of age, an event which was only a couple years in the offing. Zoe needed support, and she needed it now. If she were to marry Leo, for one, his prestige had been lowered by his back-to-back defeats, so what he would bring to the throne as a military mind was questionable. Not only that, but as the leading family in the military aristocracy, the Phokades did have some enemies and detractors. They were especially unpopular among the officialdom of Constantinople. There was a definite struggle between the military aristocracy in Anatolia and the Constantinople bureaucrats, and each side distrusted the other. Because of this, the officials in Constantinople saw that Leo and Zoe were getting buddy-buddy, and they began to seek out other allies to counterbalance an alliance of the Empress and the Domesticus, an alliance which would be too strong to defeat. So they turned to someone who happened to be in office, happened to be local, and hadn't suffered any major defeats. We've already been introduced to this guy. His name is Romanus, and he had the advantage of not being blind. As should be plenty apparent from the fact that Romanus had allies at court who successfully interceded with Zoe not to have him blinded and then to retain him in office, Romanus enjoyed plenty of support, and he had been cultivating it for a while. One of his supporters was none other than Constantine VII's tutor, Theodore, who was either able to convince his young pupil to write a letter, or he simply wrote a letter on behalf of Constantine to Romanus asking him to protect the young ruler from ambitious nobles like Leo Phocas. Most likely this is not because people like Theodore legitimately feared that Leo would seize the throne, but rather that they didn't want to empower the military aristocracy. Romanus, as someone who was not from a traditionally powerful family, was not viewed as a threat, and most likely some of the more elitist members of the Constantinople officialdom didn't think that Romanus would dare try to claim the throne, given his own lack of an illustrious name. As for Romanus's part, he was not on good terms with Leo. They were very much rivals, and he was quite alarmed that Leo was friendly with the Empress. Now, of course, he basically started the feud with Leo by leaving him hanging in Bulgaria. That being said, Romanus knew that Leo was quite bitter about that, and that an alliance between Leo and the Empress would not be favorable for him. Not surprisingly, Leo convinced Zoe that Romanus needed to be removed from command of the fleet. So she dispatched her parakoimomenos named Constantine, who was a eunuch, to order Romanus to disband the fleet. She thought that this would take away his standing force and he would not be able to launch a coup. However, rather than obeying the order, Romanus simply arrested Constantine and proceeded to do what he wanted. Zoe, for her part, then summoned a council for an emergency session about how to deal with Romanus, the rogue Drungarius. When she summoned her council, however, rather than sharing her outrage and concern, her ministers instead had Constantine VII come out and read a prepared statement where he said that he no longer had confidence in her ability to run the government and that a new council of regency was going to be formed. The coup was thus accomplished by Romanus's allies in the palace. Zoe was confined to the women's quarters. Initially, her opponents wanted to send her back to the convent, but young Constantine VII intervened on her behalf with tears in his eyes, and it was hard to refuse a boy emperor, since he would soon be a man and could potentially punish anyone who had violated his will. So Zoe was retained in the palace, but she lost all of her privileges, and she was there simply for the sake of her son. The new regents who would be running the Byzantine government for the next couple years were Patriarch Nicholas Mysticus, who had already held this office before, and the Magister Stephen. Nicholas Mysticus was not someone who was very politically competent, but he was clearly the senior partner in this arrangement, and he was dedicated to the task of trying to reestablish church norms more than actually governing. The church norms that were violated, by the way, had been violated by Leo VI, who had married illegally for the fourth time and produced Constantine, who technically should have been illegitimate by the existing rules of the church until Leo had them changed. But we're not going to get too deep into that. One of the Patriarch's earliest moves was to immediately remove Leo as Domesticus of the East. This was a major blow for Leo, and it meant that not only was the government now in the hands of other people who were not friendly to him, but he was deprived of his power base. At this juncture, Leo seems to have accepted the new status quo and accepted that he had been defeated. Perhaps he knew that he was on good terms with young Constantine. They presumably had met while Leo had been making arrangements with Zoe, and he knew that once the young man took office that things would change. However, this understanding of politics changed for Leo on March 25, 919, when Romanus sailed to the palace and announced that he was now taking over the government. This was a second coup by a man who had been aligned with the people who made the first coup, but was now taking it a step further and asserting his own right to the throne. Up to this point, it would appear that Leo, a thoroughgoing aristocrat, had underestimated Romanus due to his humble heritage, and had not thought that Romanus had any real chance of potentially claiming the throne. However, Romanus's actions in early 919 showed that he was deeply ambitious. In April of 919, Romanus took the title of Basiliopater, which is effectively father-in-law of the emperor, and became Constantine's father-in-law by marrying Constantine to his daughter Helena. After that point, Leo understood that Romanus clearly intended to take a crown. Constantine was a relatively sickly young man even at this juncture, and many people thought that he would die. So it wasn't hard to imagine a scenario where Romanus crowned himself as colleague, and then Constantine happened to simply die under mysterious circumstances, thus leaving the throne in the hands of the Lecapenus. Outraged, Leo raised the banner of revolt and declared that he was acting to save Constantine VII from a usurper. And while, just like any Byzantine aristocrat, he most likely was acting primarily in his own self-interest, there is at least a reasonable possibility that Leo was quite sincere in his intentions to save Constantine from a usurper. He most likely had grown close to both the boy and his mother, and the reason why I think that that is the case is if you look at the way that Constantine treats the Phokades after he reclaims the throne from Romanus in the 940s, he goes way beyond the call of duty and repaying the debt he felt that he owed to them. He rewarded Leo's brother Bardas with the command that Bardas had done very little to actually merit based on his military abilities. So clearly there was a strong relationship between Leo and the young boy emperor. Based on the generally negative things that Constantine would later say about his father-in-law Romanus Lecapenus, it's safe to say that he was rooting for Leo and his revolt. However, Leo would quickly prove to be as inept of a rebel as he had been as a major field commander. He set up his camp at Chrysopolis and rallied hundreds of men to his banner. He said that he was going to free the emperor and get rid of the usurper, which is an appealing call. However, Romanus knew that it would be easier to simply undermine Leo's credibility by using the power of the throne rather than bothering to actually fight him in a pitched battle. So what he did was he dispatched two envoys, one a priest and the other a prostitute, the kinds of people who would frequent any kind of military gathering and mostly go unnoticed, and he sent them with copies of a letter that he had had Constantine sign, saying that the young ruler backed Romanus, that Romanus was a legitimate representative of the crown, and that Leo Phocas was a traitor to the same crown. This letter seems to have been quite convincing to most of the men who saw it or read it, and this caused support for Leo to plummet dangerously. The priest was quickly arrested. He seemed to stick out a little bit. Maybe he wasn't quite as subtle as he should have been, and Leo most likely thought that he was then safe from any of Romanus's tricks. However, the prostitute was much more effective, and she was able to get the message out to the majority of his men. The ones who didn't end up defecting or deserting simply then arrested their leader and turned him over to Romanus to get a reward. Leo tried to flee, but he was seized, and then the overzealous people who captured him decided to blind him in order to show just how sorry they were for considering their treason. When he heard the news that his great rival Leo Phocas had been blinded, Romanus was actually furious. He was someone who later would be called the gentle usurper by historians because he was very reluctant to inflict any kind of severe punishment on people when it came to things like blinding or execution. He preferred to simply exile his opponents. In the case of Leo Phocas the Elder, he would have been especially annoyed that the man had been blinded, since this would have meant that the Phokades would then have to turn to Leo's brother Bardas. Now, while Bardas was no great military genius, he had not embarrassed himself the same way that Leo had. A fully healthy and functional Leo, who most likely was not very old at this time, would ensure that the Phokades would remain under the nominal leadership of someone who was inept both militarily and politically. This meant that despite the great power of the family, they would effectively be neutralized as a threat because their leader was someone that no one wanted to rally behind since he was a known failure. With him out of the picture, however, this meant that Romanus now would have to deal with the Phokades in a more clever manner by appeasing them to some degree and playing a balancing act between them and the other military aristocracy families. When another conspiracy broke out a few weeks later, however, Romanus showed that his regret for what had happened to Leo had some limits, since one of the ways that he helped to undermine this new conspiracy was to parade Leo through the streets and have him pelted by the people. The Phokades were not that popular in the city at this time, and Leo, as someone who had just launched a failed revolt, was deeply unpopular. So this was a way for Romanus to shore himself up by allowing the people to take out their rage on a distant military aristocrat who had gotten them involved in wars and then lost two battles, partly again due to his own idiocy. We don't know how long Leo survived after being blinded, but it could have been any number of years. Certainly by the time that Constantine VII ousted Romanus and his sons in late 944, Leo had died before that point. Bardas, because of his brother's blindness, was clearly the family's leader from 919 forward. If we had to really take away a lesson from the life of Leo the Phocas the Elder, He is a testament to the power of rank and privilege in Byzantium and really in any society with a landed aristocracy. While he does seem to have had personal charm and he seems to have had some degree of loyalty that was rather rare, he doesn't seem to have backed that up with any real ability. He's someone who would never have risen to the rank of commander-in-chief of the Eastern armies if he hadn't been born with a certain last name. Leo is someone who simply was not on the same level as either his father, the great Nicephorus Phocas the Elder, or his two nephews, his namesake Leo and then his nephew, the Emperor Nicephorus II. Leo's incompetence effectively allowed Romanus's usurpation. This is both his incompetence in terms of losing two major battles, one of which was largely the fault of Romanus, that being Anchialus, and then his half-baked revolt that was undermined by a prostitute caused a young Constantine VII to at least have a debt of gratitude for the Phokades, which would pay off in droves for Leo the Elder's nephews. So he did well by his own family, and he tried to do well by the empire, but he was someone whose intentions were far better than his actual ability to deliver. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian, and we will be covering more Roman and Byzantine generals in the future.